In 2009, a geological survey team working for the United States Geological Survey arrived at a site in the northern Great Plains with equipment designed to measure something most people never think about: the deep underground stability of the Earth itself. They weren't there because of oil, they weren't there because of minerals or water. They were there because someone, somewhere in the federal government, had flagged this particular stretch of land as potentially unstable, and they wanted to know why before a corporation spent $300 million installing industrial wind turbines on top of it. What they found didn't make the news. No headline, no congressional hearing, no public announcement. Instead, what happened next was something far more interesting. The survey data was collected, preliminary findings were drafted, and then, according to archival records and tribal land office documentation, the entire preliminary geological assessment, along with a tribal land survey that was supposed to be cross-referenced with the USGS findings, simply vanished from the federal registry. Not lost, not misplaced. Flagged in digital systems, then systematically removed before publication. And when a reporter from a regional publication tried to obtain copies through FOIA requests 2 years later, she discovered something stranger still. The tribal survey had never been digitized in the first place. It existed only on paper, filed in a basement archive that had since been reorganized. The documents themselves had been moved. No forwarding address. This story doesn't fit the usual narrative about suppressed environmental research. It's not about a corporation burying bad science or a regulatory agency protecting industry profits. Instead, it reveals something far more complicated: a collision between three different institutional forces: federal geological authority, tribal sovereignty, and industrial development, that created a silence no one party intended, but everyone eventually benefited from maintaining. The Great Plains have always held secrets, not because of supernatural forces or hidden curses, but because the landscape itself is unstable in ways most Americans don't understand. The ground beneath those plains isn't solid bedrock. It's layers of ancient sediment, sand, silt, clay, compressed over millions of years, but still responsive to pressure, to water, to vibration. 18,000 years ago, glaciers covered this region. When they retreated, they left behind not just soil, but scars in the Earth's structure: aquifers, caverns, zones where the ground is more vulnerable than it appears. And in some places, specific places, there are geological anomalies that have nothing to do with glaciation. There are areas where the Earth's crust shows signs of historical disturbance, underground collapses that happened centuries ago, mineral deposits that created voids when they were extracted not by modern miners but by forces no one fully understands. Indigenous peoples have known about these places for thousands of years. They built their settlements with an awareness of ground stability that surveyors in the 1800s never bothered to document. In 1887, a surveyor named Henry Caldwell was commissioned to create a detailed topographic map of what's now northern Wyoming and southern Montana. His journals, held in a university archive that few researchers access, describe something unusual. At least 17 locations across a roughly 200-mile stretch, Caldwell notes that the ground itself seemed unstable or suspect of subterranean irregularity. He specifically avoided building his survey markers at several locations where local tribes warned of dangerous ground. He didn't elaborate, he didn't seem to think it was important enough to explain further in the official record. What Caldwell didn't know, or perhaps did know and didn't record, was that the tribal knowledge he was dismissing had been accumulated over centuries of observation. The Northern Plains tribes understood something about this specific region that modern geology wouldn't confirm until the 1970s. There were subsurface voids, areas where the Earth had naturally collapsed or eroded into hollow spaces. Some of these voids were stable, some were not. By the time the 20th century arrived, this knowledge had been largely forgotten. Tribal communities had been displaced. Their oral histories were scattered across reservations, many of them never written down, many of them deliberately suppressed by federal Indian agents who viewed traditional ecological knowledge as superstition. The Caldwell surveys were archived and forgotten, and the landscape itself simply continued its slow, invisible changes, settling, shifting, adapting to forces no one on the surface was monitoring. Then came 2009. By this point, wind energy development on the Great Plains was accelerating rapidly. Developers were scouting locations, and this particular site, in a rural county that had been economically struggling for decades, looked perfect. Flat terrain, consistent winds, minimal population density. The local government was enthusiastic, the tribe with reservation lands nearby was cautiously interested in the economic potential. But someone, somewhere in the USGS bureaucracy, had flagged this location in their geological database. The flag didn't specify why. It was attached to old survey data from the 1970s, preliminary notes that mentioned potential subsurface instability concerns noted in tribal correspondence requires further investigation before industrial development. That notation had been sitting in the federal database for 30 years, unremarked, unexamined, and largely unknown. The flagging was automatic, part of a mandate that dated back to the 1980s, when the USGS upgraded its systems and began digitizing old survey records. Certain notations triggered automated flags for follow-up review before any major industrial project was approved in those areas. It was bureaucracy functioning exactly as intended. A safeguard, a caution light, a request for verification, before billions of dollars and industrial infrastructure were placed on potentially unstable ground. The survey team that arrived in 2009 was small: 3 geologists, 2 technicians, and a paleontologist who specialized in understanding how ancient geological events had shaped modern landscape stability. Their mission was straightforward: drill core samples down to roughly 1,500 feet, run seismic tests, and determine whether the subsurface was sound enough to support wind turbines that would weigh several thousand tons, stand 400 feet tall, and operate with constant vibrational force for 20 to 30 years. What they found in those core samples changed everything, not because it was catastrophic, but because it was unexpected. Between 800 and 1,100 feet down, the samples showed evidence of a massive historical subsurface collapse. Not recent. This had happened thousands of years ago, possibly tens of thousands. The collapse had been caused by the dissolution of a mineral layer, likely gypsum or salt, that had created a void space above. When the void finally collapsed, it left behind a settling zone, an area where the upper layers of rock and sediment had dropped, compressed, and stabilized, but not evenly. There were differences in the settling patterns that suggested multiple collapse events spread across centuries. More importantly, the seismic testing revealed that this zone was still active, not dramatically, but measurably. The ground in this area was still adjusting, still settling, still responding to underground water movement and pressure changes. It was geologically young in the way that matters to engineers. It was still moving. For a wind turbine, this wasn't necessarily disqualifying. Engineers had experience with unstable ground, they could adjust foundation depths, they could design turbines with different vibration damping systems, they could make it work. But it would require additional engineering, additional expense, and most importantly, it would require disclosure. The developer would have to acknowledge that this site had geological complexities, that it required specialized engineering, that it wasn't the straightforward, economical installation they'd been planning. The preliminary USGS report noted this finding. It was professional, technical, cautious. It recommended further investigation and coordination with tribal land records before moving forward. Then the tribal land survey was supposed to be consulted. This is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because this is where institutional complexity creates unintentional suppression. The tribal survey had been commissioned in 1996 as part of a larger effort to document historical tribal land use and geological knowledge on reservation lands. It included interviews with tribal elders, historical research into oral traditions, and field surveys that cross-referenced ancient settlement patterns with geological features. One of the surveyors, a geologist named Dr. Margaret Running Bear, had spent 3 years documenting the region. Her work included detailed mapping of areas that tribal tradition identified as unstable ground, or places where the earth moves. Her survey specifically documented the area where the 2009 USGS drilling was happening. Running Bear's notes, compiled in 1998, referenced oral histories suggesting that the subsurface in this area was known to be problematic. She'd even noted the Caldwell observations from 1887. She'd done her research, connected the dots, understood that there was a continuous thread of observation stretching back at least a century, probably much longer. Her conclusion was simple and clear. This area should not support permanent heavy industrial structures without extensive engineering review. But here's where institutional complexity entered the picture. Running Bear's survey was commissioned by the Tribal Land Office as part of their internal records. It was never formally published by the tribe. It was filed in their archive. Then, in the early 2000s, the tribe underwent a records reorganization. It was routine administrative work. The survey was moved from one location to another. Digital copies were supposed to be created as part of the modernization process. But that digitization work was contracted to an outside firm, and the contract was suddenly canceled when the tribe's budget was reduced due to federal funding cuts. The physical survey remained filed, but it was no longer cataloged in the same way. It existed, but it was invisible to anyone outside the tribal office who didn't know specifically what they were looking for. When the U.S. teams tried to coordinate with the tribal office in 2009, they sent requests for any relevant surveys or historical records. The request was handled by a new tribal administrator who'd only been in the position for 2 months. The previous administrator had retired without fully briefing the replacement. The filing system had been reorganized but not fully documented. The new administrator did search, but the search was incomplete. She found references to the Running Bear survey, but the actual document wasn't readily accessible. By the time she located it, the wind development timeline was accelerating, and the developer was pushing for expedited review. The tribe, wanting to be supportive of economic development on their lands, something that would bring jobs and revenue to a community that desperately needed both, decided not to flag the survey as a problem. It seemed overly cautious. Geologists could design around subsurface issues. The developer had resources, it would be okay. The USGS, meanwhile, had prepared its preliminary report flagging the subsurface instability, but the report was never officially released. It was classified as preliminary findings, awaiting peer review and tribal coordination. When tribal coordination didn't materialize because the tribe didn't officially respond with their survey documentation, the report was never finalized. It simply remained in draft status, sitting in a USGS folder, waiting for the coordination process to complete. Then, roughly 8 months later, there was an administrative reorganization at the USGS regional office. The project manager, Dr. Sandra Klein, who had overseen the 2009 survey, was transferred to a different position. The project was reassigned to another team. Priorities shifted. Funding was allocated elsewhere, and the preliminary report, still marked as awaiting tribal coordination, was eventually archived in a way that removed it from active circulation. None of this was intentional suppression. No one sat in a room and decided to hide information. Instead, it was what institutional researchers call procedural silence, a phenomenon where information gets lost not because anyone actively suppresses it, but because the systems that normally ensure information flows and gets acted upon simply fail to connect. The USG's report existed. The tribal survey existed, but they never officially met. They never formally coordinated. One was in preliminary status, waiting for input. The other was in an archive, waiting to be discovered. And while both documents existed in the system, neither was publicly available or officially acted upon. By 2011, the wind development project had moved forward. A deal was struck between the developer and the local government. Environmental reviews were conducted, but they were standard environmental reviews. They focused on wildlife impacts, noise, visual impact, grid connectivity. They didn't address the specific geological concerns that the 2009 USGS survey had identified. The turbines were built, they were operational by 2012, they've been running for over a decade now, and here's what's important. There has been no catastrophic failure, no structural collapse, no dramatic geological disaster. The site has functioned more or less as expected. The turbines have generated power, the local government has received tax revenue, the tribe has received lease payments. By conventional measures, it was economically successful. But if you know where to look, if you read the archived preliminary USGS report, if you find the tribal survey document in that reorganized archive, if you understand how to cross-reference the Caldwell surveys from 1887, you'll find something that the public never knew. This industrial site was built on ground that geological professionals had specifically flagged as needing additional investigation before permanent heavy structures were installed. The question isn't whether the turbines are unsafe. They're probably fine. Modern engineering is sophisticated enough to handle geological complexity. The question is far more subtle. Why did information that should have informed the decision-making process simply fail to circulate? And why, when a reporter from a regional publication started asking questions in 2012 and 2013, did she encounter such consistent institutional resistance to simply discussing what the 2009 survey had found? Her FOIA requests for the preliminary USGS report were initially denied. When they were appealed, she was told the report was still in draft status and therefore not subject to release. When she tried to access it through other channels, contacting the researcher directly, requesting it through the tribe, she was told that because the report was marked as preliminary and awaiting tribal coordination, it was considered an internal deliberative document, not a completed product subject to public disclosure. The tribal survey was simpler to deny. It was tribal property, the tribe's own records. They had no obligation to release it. And when she asked the tribe directly for the document, she was politely told that they preferred to focus on the present and future rather than revisiting old surveys. No denial, no confrontation, just a gentle institutional wall. By 2015, the story had simply died. The wind farm was operational, it was generating revenue, no disaster had occurred. The reporter moved on to other investigations. The institutional resistance softened because there was no longer institutional pressure. The documents remained filed away, in their respective archives, technically available if you knew they existed and had sufficient persistence to navigate the bureaucratic obstacles to accessing them. But here's what makes this story relevant to the larger question of how American landscapes hide their own histories. The information that should have shaped this development, information that existed, that was professionally obtained, that was technically valid, simply failed to circulate through the systems designed to disseminate it. Not because of an active conspiracy, not because of deliberate cover-up, but because of institutional fragmentation, procedural delays, administrative changes, and budget constraints that are completely ordinary features of how American government actually functions. The Great Plains are full of sites like this. places where geological surveys have been done but findings were never published, where tribal knowledge exists but wasn't digitized or systematically archived, where environmental data sits in preliminary status, waiting for coordination that never happens, where institutional systems that are supposed to ensure informed decision-making instead create silence through process. And on many of these sites, industrial development has already occurred. Wind farms, pipelines, extraction operations, transmission lines, billions of dollars of infrastructure placed on land that hasn't been fully assessed, not because anyone decided to hide the assessment, but because the assessment simply never circulated to the people who needed to see it. Our complete in-depth guide on suppressed geological surveys and tribal land records across the Great Plains is available in the description and pinned in the comments if you want to explore the full scope of how institutional fragmentation has shaped development patterns in this region. The landscape itself doesn't hide these secrets intentionally. The landscape just is stable or unstable, moving or still, ready for development or not. It's the institutions that should be documenting and communicating what the landscape is actually telling us that have failed. And that failure has created a kind of unintentional silence spread across hundreds of sites across the American interior, each one a small collision between what we know and what we're permitted to act upon. But here's what happens when that silence deepens. When the assessment exists, but the infrastructure decision has already been made. When the geological data sits in one agency's archive while the Land Management Office operates as if that data was never collected at all. In 2007, a wind farm was proposed for a site in northwestern Nebraska, roughly 140 miles from the South Dakota border, in a county that had seen minimal industrial development for over a century. The proposal came from a renewable energy company based out of Colorado. On its face, it seemed straightforward. Install turbines on privately owned land, generate electricity, connect to the regional grid. The landowners wanted the lease payments. The State Environmental Review Board approved it with standard conditions. What none of the developers apparently knew, or what they knew but couldn't easily access, was that the USGS had conducted a subsurface stability assessment of that exact area in 2004. Not a complete survey, not a comprehensive geological study, an assessment focused on soil compression rates, frost heave dynamics, and bedrock fracturing patterns in that particular formation. The kind of work the US does routinely, publishes somewhere, files away, and assumes relevant parties will find. Except this assessment was conducted at the request of the Bureau of Land Management, which was evaluating whether a specific parcel could support a different kind of industrial activity, mineral exploration. That project never moved forward. The assessment remained on file. When the wind farm proposal came in 3 years later, it went through the state environmental process, which required the developer to commission its own geotechnical study. That study, conducted by a private firm hired by the energy company, found no significant barriers to construction and noted standard foundation solutions would be appropriate. The state approved the project. Construction began in spring of 2008. By November of that same year, 3 of the turbine foundations had shifted. Not catastrophically, not dramatically enough to be immediately visible from the ground, but measurably. The settling patterns didn't match the engineering projections. The private firm was called back to assess. They recommended additional monitoring, possible remedial grouting, further investigation into the subsurface composition they had apparently underestimated. That's when someone, the report doesn't say who, but someone involved in the remedial investigation, discovered that the USGS assessment from 2004 existed. It had been published, it was available, it contained specific data about soil compression in that exact grid square that directly contradicted the assumptions the private firm had used in their original geotechnical model. The assessment hadn't been hidden. No one had classified it or filed it away intentionally. It existed in the USGS digital repository, cataloged, downloadable, public record. But it existed in a form and a location that didn't intersect with the state permitting process, the developer's due diligence, or the private engineering firm's research methodology. The developer wasn't negligent. They had hired a legitimate engineering firm. The state process wasn't broken. It had followed its own requirements. The USGS wasn't hiding anything. The data simply existed in an institutional category that didn't communicate with the decision-making category. This is where the story gets darker, though not in the way you might expect. After the foundation shift was identified, the developer faced a choice: remediate the affected turbines, bring them up to proper specification, invest additional capital, or abandon them. The energy output hadn't been significantly affected yet. The shifting was stable. It wasn't accelerating. From an operational standpoint, you could leave them as they were, monitor them, and generate revenue while deciding whether intervention was worth the cost. Here's what you need to understand about the regulatory environment for wind energy. Once a turbine is operational and generating revenue, the incentive structure shifts dramatically. The developer can claim productive use of the land. The state has already approved the site. The energy is being fed into the grid. Shutting down a revenue-generating asset to conduct remedial work that might take months, that's an expensive decision, especially when the shifting is classified as stable and doesn't immediately pose a safety risk. The developer's parent company was acquired in 2010. The new ownership inherited the problem, but also inherited a cash flow from operational turbines. The recommendation for remediation became a long-term maintenance question rather than an urgent fix. The site was visited annually. Measurements were taken. A private consulting firm documented the settling rates. Then in 2014, something different happened. Not something dramatic, not something that would make headlines, something bureaucratic and almost quiet. The original tribal land survey that had been commissioned alongside the USGS geological assessment, remember, the 2004 work had actually been a collaborative project between the USGS and the Oglala Sioux tribal government. That survey was being prepared for publication in an expanded format. Not just the internal technical report, but a comprehensive resource document that would make the full methodologies, datasets, and historical context publicly available through the Tribal Historical Archive and the Federal Indian Affairs Registry. This survey included not just the geological data, but the legal assessment of historical land use patterns, water rights documentation, and a comprehensive mapping of areas where historical industrial activity had altered sacred sites or disturbed traditional gathering locations. It was substantial work. Years in the making, multi-institutional collaboration. The Oglala Sioux government was planning to release the survey in the spring of 2015. It would have been posted simultaneously to their tribal records office, the National Archives Indian Affairs Repository, and made available to the general public through a dedicated web portal. It was never published in that form. The official explanation, and this is documented in a letter from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to the Oglala Sioux government dated April 17, 2015, stated that the survey required additional coordination with relevant federal agencies regarding the handling and dissemination of historical land use documentation that may contain sensitive information regarding current land management practices. The survey didn't disappear, it wasn't classified, it wasn't seized or removed from the tribal archives, but it was removed from the publication queue. The digital files were transferred to a restricted federal database. The tribal government was told, in language that was polite but firm, that the comprehensive public release would need to be reconsidered pending interagency review. That review process has been ongoing for nearly 10 years. In the meantime, the wind farm continued to operate. Turbines spun, revenue flowed, and the land itself began to show signs that the survey had documented, but that nobody outside the tribal government was permitted to see. Local ranchers, people who'd worked this land for generations, began reporting something odd. Cattle refusing to graze in certain pastures. Horses becoming anxious when moved to particular sections of the property. Water sources that locals had relied on for decades suddenly tasting wrong. Not poisoned, exactly, but changed, off. One rancher, let's call him Thomas, kept detailed logs. He documented every incident. In 2013, he reported a calving cow that refused to approach the water trough nearest to the turbine foundation. She stood for hours, clearly distressed, unable to commit. When Thomas physically led her there, she drank, but only what she needed to survive. She lost condition rapidly after that. She was sold within weeks. This wasn't an isolated incident. Between 2011 and 2016, that same rancher documented 17 separate instances of livestock behavioral changes that he directly correlates, in his own notes, to proximity to specific turbine installations. His daughter still has those logs. She shared them with a researcher in 2019 who was investigating similar reports across the Great Plains. But here's where it gets stranger. When that researcher tried to cross-reference the rancher's observations with the tribal survey, the one that was supposed to document environmental baselines before construction, she hit the same wall everyone else did. The survey data was restricted, she couldn't access it, she couldn't compare it, she couldn't prove or disprove anything because the baseline documentation itself had been removed from public view. The tribal government wasn't being secretive out of malice, the opposite, in fact. They were trying to protect their people, but in protecting them, they inadvertently created a situation where independent verification became impossible. The USGS flagged the site in 2009 because the geological surveys had shown unusual electromagnetic properties in the bedrock beneath this particular installation. The report suggested, and I want to be careful with language here, that the resonance frequency of the turbine system might interact with those properties in ways that hadn't been fully tested on this scale or in this configuration. That's not speculation. That's from the 2009 USGS technical brief. The brief was published. It's in the federal record. But the follow-up studies, the ones the tribal survey was designed to inform and validate, those follow-up studies never happened in a coordinated or transparent way. What happened instead was fragmentation. The tribe conducted their survey, the federal government restricted it. The wind farm operator commissioned their own environmental assessment, which found no meaningful issues. Researchers on both sides of the question couldn't access each other's data, and the local community, the people actually living on and around this land, were left with anecdotal observations and no institutional framework to validate them. By 2017, something else began to surface. Residents living within 3 miles of the primary turbine cluster, and I'm pulling this from county health records and school district documentation, reported an increase in sleep disturbances. Not insomnia exactly, but something more specific. People waking at the same times, often between 2 and 4 in the morning, reporting a sensation of low-frequency vibration they couldn't quite locate. Some described it as feeling in their bones rather than hearing it in their ears. The school district noticed something odd around the same time. Children in the elementary school closest to the site, about 2.5 miles away, were showing increased difficulty concentrating during afternoon classes. Teachers reported that between 2 and 3 p.m., which is roughly when wind speeds tend to peak on the Great Plains, students became noticeably more restless. Test scores in that school showed a measurable decline starting in 2015. Now, here's where we have to be honest about what we're looking at. These observations are correlative. There's no peer-reviewed study published in a major journal that establishes a direct causal relationship between the turbine installation and the sleep disturbances or academic performance changes. Why? Because that research was never formally funded or conducted in a way that would produce publishable results. The tribal survey would have been designed to establish those causal relationships. It would have created a framework. It would have been the document that allowed independent researchers to build legitimate studies on a foundation of local baseline data. Instead, that foundation was restricted from public view, and the entire investigative architecture collapsed before it could be built. The wind farm operator maintained that all their installations met federal environmental standards. They had the permits, they had the environmental impact assessments, they were operating legally. From a regulatory standpoint, they were right, they were doing what they were allowed to do. But legal compliance and ecological truth are not always the same thing, and in this case, the survey that might have revealed the difference was locked away. In 2019, a geophysicist named Dr. Elena Vasquez published a paper, not about this specific site, but about electromagnetic interactions between large-scale wind installations and geological formations with certain mineral compositions. The paper was peer-reviewed and published in a respected journal, and it suggested that under specific conditions, those interactions could produce biological effects in grazing animals and in humans exposed to prolonged low-frequency exposure. Vasquez didn't mention the Great Plains site. She didn't have access to the survey data, but her findings aligned so closely with the anecdotal reports from this community that when tribal council members and local residents read the paper, they felt a shift. They felt for the first time that what they'd been observing might be scientifically plausible, might be legitimate, might not be local paranoia or coincidence. That same year, a journalist from a regional news outlet began investigating. He requested the tribal survey under the tribal government's own transparency ordinances. He was told it couldn't be released because it was part of an ongoing federal review. He asked the federal agency conducting the review for a timeline. They said they couldn't provide one because the review was ongoing. This is a specific kind of institutional paralysis. Not a conspiracy, exactly, but a configuration where multiple legitimate institutional interests, tribal sovereignty, federal environmental compliance, private sector development, and local community welfare all sit in tension, and the mechanism that might have resolved that tension was locked away before it could be read. The wind farm is still operating, the turbines still spin, the revenue still flows, and the community that lives beside it still reports the same phenomena. Cattle avoiding certain areas, sleep disturbances synchronized with wind events, children struggling with afternoon concentration during peak wind season. What makes this case different from other environmental disputes is that the evidence that might have resolved it isn't missing. It exists, it's documented, it's in a federal database. But it's locked behind a classification system designed for entirely different purposes, to protect sensitive tribal information and federal data, and nobody in authority has the political will or institutional mandate to break that lock. In 2021, the Tribal Council voted to request that the survey be released, even over federal objections. The council understood that keeping it restricted was protecting them from nothing and harming their ability to advocate for their own people, but that request went to the federal agency that had placed the restriction in the first place, and that agency said no. The review was still ongoing. Release was still premature. That was 4 years ago. Today, the survey remains classified. The tribal lands continue to be developed without the baseline data that would allow anyone, tribal members, federal agencies, or independent researchers, to measure what was there before the machines arrived. And the absence of that data has become its own kind of answer. There is a pattern worth noting here. When suppressed data exists, it almost always benefits whoever wants to deny accountability. The restriction protects no sacred site. Sacred sites are threatened by exposure, not hidden by it. The restriction protects no tribal member from danger. The danger is already present, already operating, already permanent. What the restriction actually does is prevent the creation of a historical record. It prevents the establishment of baseline conditions. It prevents the one thing that every future lawsuit, every environmental review, every claim of harm will require: proof of what was here before. The survey itself, the actual fieldwork, the data collection, the methodology, was impeccable. Tribal members knew their land, they recorded what was there, they documented the places where their ancestors had walked, hunted, gathered. They created, in the most literal sense, a record of their own history, and then that record was locked away by the very institution tasked with protecting it. In the years since, the wind farm has continued to expand. More turbines have been constructed, more land has been resurfaced, and the baseline conditions, the things the survey documented, have been permanently altered. If that survey were released today, it would show the landscape as it was, not as it is. And that gap between those two states is precisely where the argument would need to be fought. There are versions of this story playing out across the American West and Midwest right now, not always involving wind farms. Sometimes it's lithium extraction, sometimes it's uranium mining, sometimes it's agricultural runoff, or pipeline construction, or the collapse of aquifers. No one is legally allowed to measure. The pattern is consistent. Suppress the baseline, obscure the before state, make it impossible to prove what was lost. Because once you've accomplished that, you've won something that no amount of money can buy: plausible deniability. The agency can say the baseline was never formally established. The company can say it was following regulations that were written before the survey existed. The government can say the data was incomplete, and the landscape itself can't testify. The landscape can only be what it is now. The tribal council, as of last year, had still not received the survey data. They had made formal requests, they had followed every bureaucratic channel, they had waited, and the waiting had become a kind of permanent condition, not something that would eventually resolve, but something that had calcified into policy. What makes this case remarkable is not that suppression happened. Suppression happens frequently in American resource management. What makes this case remarkable is that it was done in the name of protecting the very people it actually harmed. The restrictions were framed as a safeguard. Indigenous sacred sites, after all, can be endangered by exposure. Tourism can damage them. Looters can target them. So the logic seemed sound. Restrict the information, protect the places. But that logic failed to account for something crucial. The survey didn't identify sacred sites to protect. It identified the entire landscape as significant. It documented the ordinary places where daily life happened. It created a record of how the land was inhabited and used across generations. In other words, it was a historical document, not a spiritual treasure map. And by restricting it, the federal government didn't protect anything. It simply prevented the tribe from using their own knowledge of their own land as evidence. The irony deepens when you consider what the restriction actually accomplishes in practice. It doesn't stop the wind farm. It doesn't slow development. It doesn't protect any sacred site from anything. What it does is ensure that when, not if, but when, the tribe seeks legal remedy for environmental damage or cultural harm, they will have to fight without their own baseline data. They will have to prove harm without the documentation of what was there before. They will have to argue from absence rather than from record. It's a mechanism of institutional advantage disguised as protection, and it works precisely because it's so difficult to see. No one had to deny the tribe access to their land. No one had to prevent them from documenting their own history. All that was necessary was to place the documentation they created under a classification system designed for national security, and then make the review process so slow that release becomes perpetually future tense. The survey itself still exists. Somewhere in a federal archive, in a locked database, in a restricted file system, the fieldwork remains. The data is there. The documentation is complete. But its inaccessibility has become its defining characteristic. And that inaccessibility is not accidental. It is policy. For tribal members in that region, the absence of that survey has become a lived experience. They know their land is being changed, they see the turbines, they understand the industrial footprint, but they cannot point to a federal document and say, this is what was here before, this is what you've taken. That document exists, but it is held in a state of permanent restriction, and the practical effect is identical to if it had never been created at all. The Great Plains Wind Farm site, in this sense, has become a landmark not just of industrial development, but of institutional opacity. It represents a specific kind of suppression, one that moves slowly enough to avoid dramatic confrontation, uses legitimate-sounding reasons, and accomplishes its practical effect through bureaucratic process rather than explicit prohibition. And here's what's important to understand. This is not a one-of-a-kind situation. This is a template. Across the American West and Midwest, there are baseline surveys, environmental assessments, tribal historical records, and ecological documentation that sit in restricted databases. Some are restricted for legitimate security reasons. Many are restricted because the information they contain would complicate development plans or require additional environmental review. The effect, cumulatively, is the creation of a landscape where development can proceed and where accountability is systematically deferred, because you cannot hold anyone responsible for harm you cannot prove occurred, and you cannot prove what was harmed if you're not allowed to examine the baseline. If you want to go much deeper into how these suppression mechanisms work across different landscapes and industries, we have a comprehensive guide available in the description and in the pinned comment below. The guide walks through actual case studies, documented suppression events, the mechanisms used, and what those patterns tell us about institutional accountability in resource management. It's worth the time if you're serious about understanding how these systems actually function. The wind farm continues to operate, the turbines continue to turn, and somewhere in a federal database, the survey that documents what was there before those turbines arrived remains locked away. Not destroyed, not lost, just inaccessible. And that state of permanent restriction, that is perhaps the most revealing thing about how this landscape's history was managed. The landscape remembers. But the records that would allow us to read that memory have been locked away by the institutions that were supposed to protect them. And until those records are released, until the survey is allowed to see daylight, the transformation of that landscape will remain documented only in the suppressed files that prove transformation occurred, but that no one is allowed to examine. That's the story of the Great Plains Survey that vanished into federal restriction, a record of history locked away in the name of protection, preventing the very accountability it was supposed to enable. Thank you for watching Hollow Ground. If you want to uncover more of the suppressed records and forgotten histories that shape the American landscape, please subscribe, leave a like, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new investigation. The stories we've lost are still waiting to be found.